So that's the intro and the first chorus of Newk's Fadeaway by Sonny Rollins. Now, I talked in my last video about the intro and all the different ways that he uses enclosures and sort of bridges the gap between chord tones. Today we're going to talk about something different. Today we're going to be talking about how he does or doesn't play the changes, among other things. He starts out in that first A section, and he the chords I've got written over my transcription are sort of generic rhythm changes chords, but in fact, there's a couple of different ways that you can play the rhythm changes. One of them is, as you see, 1-6-2-5, 1-6-2-5, 2-5 to 4, 4 minor, or possibly flat 7 dominant, and then 1-6-2-5. I think, though, that Sonny Rollins is implying a different and possibly older set of changes here. I think he's implying an older set of changes which goes 1, sharp 1 diminished, 2, sharp 2 diminished, 3, 6 or 5 of 2, 2, 5, and then onward from there. Sounds a little bit like this. You can see this in the line that he plays. You could look at that lick and ignore the changes entirely, and what you would see is approach notes to chord tones. So that D sharp to E, that F sharp to G, those are just ways for Sonny to either delay the resolution of a chord tone or get to the resolution of a chord tone where he wants it, to color things up a little bit. That's actually a perfectly good way to analyze this. You could just learn the lick and say, I like that D sharp to E thing, and you wouldn't have to worry about the underlying diminished changes really at all if you don't want to. The next thing Sonny does, though, is play down a G augmented triad and resolves to 2 of C major, resolves to D. And this is a cliche that he uses all the time. You'll see it several times in this solo. That lick is basically down the 5 augmented arpeggio, resolving to 9 or 2 of the 1 chord. It's very, very common to see that because that D sharp, which is the sharp 5 of the augmented chord, resolves effectively down a half step to the 9 of the 1 chord that follows. Let's listen to it again. So that augmented arpeggio, especially descending, resolving to 9 of the 1 chord, is very common in Sonny Rollins' playing, especially of this period of time. He continues to use augmented chords later as well, but you'll see it in other tunes from the same record that we're listening to, which is Sonny Rollins and the Modern Jazz Quartet. But here it's especially interesting because the note that he resolves to, that D, happens to also be the 5 of the next chord, which is G minor 7, and he plays this chromatic descending passage that basically traverses 5 to 3, 5 to flat 3. And I think he plays this whole bar in G minor. I don't think he thinks about it in terms of C really at all. So when he plays this, so basically he's just giving us a reason to get back to C, and he does it by picking up some notes from the chord changes. That B natural on the and of 1 is an approach note to C, scalar passage, and then stair steps down again with that. It's diatonic, but it's also a chromatic approach, that B natural to C. So these last 2 bars of the first A section, he is really looking at 1, 2, 3, 5 in C major, and then he plays this lick centered around the 4th note of the scale, and it is really just a way to sort of establish distance from the tonic triad for just a minute. So it sounds like this. And that sequence on beats 3 and 4 of that second to the last bar is just it's a way to say I am not playing the 1 triad. It gives a little bit of distance. You could say it implies a dominant sound, or you can just say that it's a good way to elaborate the 1 sound with a little bit of interesting tension without it being unmelodic. So let's move on to the second A section. He plays here basically a 4-bar line, which is not really attempting to play the changes at all. That phrase that he plays through those 3 bars as the first 3 bars of the second A, he's really just stepping downward through the C major scale. And all the other stuff around it is just decorations and elaborations on it. He sort of refers to the chord tones in some cases, but he's not playing a line that, like one of the ones that he plays later, which totally outlines the harmony in no uncertain terms. He sort of just glances off the harmony, and he could be playing this over just a straight C chord, and it would still sound good. He's basically playing tonic and then away from tonic, so we could say tonic to dominant to tonic to dominant, and then that F sharp lower neighbor tone in the 3rd bar. And then the last 4 bars of the A section. So he does basically a 7-3 resolution, getting to that C7, walks downward 3-2-1-7, which is what we would call our sort of our 3 in 2 out stuff. And then he walks up the F chord using basically the C pentatonic scale. He's, playing around with F, but, you can play C over F and it sounds good. So he's basically playing C over F, which emphasizes the major 7 and the 9, sort of a pentatonic lick, and then he just jumps up, grabs that C natural and that A flat, knowing that it's going to pull him back into C. And that last 5 notes that he plays there is really like a 4-note approach to E as an enclosure, but he's using diatonic notes instead of chromatic ones. So that's a slightly different example than we've seen in the past of enclosures, but it is kind of the same technique. Is just another way to move from G to E, and he happens to not use chromatic notes. Instead, he plays. So it's a diatonic enclosure. So any of the shapes that you see enclosures being used in could also be made diatonic. They'd be more vanilla sounding, but in this case, this is the resolution of the second A section, and it makes good sense to do that. So now we come to the bridge, and this is where it gets more interesting. The bridge of rhythm changes is, of course, 3 dominant, 6 dominant, 2 dominant, 5 dominant, each 2 bars. And one of the tricks that happens all the time on bebop tunes is when you have a dominant chord of any length is you superimpose the 2 chord, because I think that what everybody thinks about this is that the 2 chord sort of smooths over and lessens the tension, and it also gives you some place to go in the future. If you're playing the 5 chord for 2 bars, you're sort of like, well, I can either elaborate it with chromaticism or something, but it doesn't give you very many places to go. And so in one sense, if you're just trying to play a dominant chord for 2 bars, the most obvious thing is to play a 2 lick in front of your 5 lick. And so this is a lot of what Sonny Rollins does in these next 8 bars. So let's look at it. The first bit is sort of the exception. He actually plays up an A pentatonic scale, sort of an A blues lick. It sounds like this. And so in playing up that A chord, he sort of surrounds the E7, the third of E7, that G sharp. Those notes that he plays at first are really in the key of A. And they don't really belong there, except that they are the resolution to what E7 is going to be. And so in a sense, he's playing 1 against 5, and it doesn't sound super inside. It sounds like he's maybe even fumbles a little, and then, man, he nails that G sharp right there in the second bar. And then from there, he plays kind of a G sharp lick. It's got a flat 9 and a sharp 9 in it. And then he has another sort of 4-note enclosure in the same way that we just saw at the end of the second A section. But at this time, it encloses C sharp. So he plays notes that are from C major. And against an E7 chord, it would be 1 flat 7, 5, flat 6, and then it resolves to 3 of the A7 chord. But you could really just think of it as a chromatic walk-up, an enclosure of C sharp. So let's listen to it again. So So that enclosure really hits the C sharp on the A7, and he steps immediately away from the A7 sound and begins to play the 2 chord. He begins to play E minor stuff. So he ends up arpeggiating the E minor 7 chord, and then dips back into A7 for a second, and then back into E minor on the downbeat of the 4th bar of the bridge, plays E minor for 2 beats, and then I think he jumps back into A7 to get a 1 to flat 7 to 3 resolution coming into D. So again, on that A7, he plays mostly the 2 chord, mostly E minor stuff through that, arpeggios and scalar and closure type stuff. And then when he gets to the D7, he does something interesting. He plays bebop scales, which I think is the first time we've really seen that here, or really first time we've talked about it. He plays down the D7 bebop scale so that he's putting F sharp on beat 1, D on beat 2, and C natural on beat 3. Sort of a perfect example of why the bebop scale is great, because it keeps all the chord tones on the main beats. So instead of maybe the way it would be played if you didn't have that extra D flat in there. That would take you to a resolution that feels like C to B natural, but with the extra D flat in there, it takes you to C natural and keeps you in the D7 sound instead of moving away from it. So then he plays up the scale from there. He plays C, D, E, G, which, wait a minute, looks surprisingly like an A minor chord. If you could read that more easily over A minor than you can over D7. So again, he's playing 2 over 5, and then he plays these 2 notes. That's the 13 and the sharp 11, which is a very sort of bebop-y thing to do, to pick up that sound in that second bar of the D7 chord. And then he doesn't just let it hang there. He waits 4 beats and resolves it to an A. So he does resolve it up a half step. He just takes a breath in between. Crafty Sonny Rollins. So then he plays, over the G7 chord, he plays A, which is, let's say it's 5 of D minor 7. Again, 2 over 5. He plays A, plays an enclosure of F, which is 3 of D minor. Jumps down to that G sharp, which is like an approach note into, again into D minor, and he plays up the arpeggio, 5, 7, 9, and then he's on 1 of G7 and plays down that augmented arpeggio again that we saw before, landing on, you guessed it, D on 2 of C. It sounds like this. He plays verbatim the 5 to 1 resolution that he played at the end of bar 7 or bar 9 back in the first A section. He'll do it again before the solo's done. He'll play it in the second chorus as well. So we get to the last A, and he plays an enclosure of C. So C doesn't land on the downbeat on beat 1; it lands on beat 2, but still on a strong beat with an enclosure. D and B natural leading to C. Then he plays up 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9. And he plays this interesting figure, repeated figure, where he plays D and C and then sort of does like a line cliche, G sharp, G, and F sharp. The G sharp that you see in the second bar of the last A section here is not easy to analyze. It could be the flat 9 of G7, a half beat early. It could be implied as like, the major 7 of an A minor chord. I don't know, actually, except that I know he keeps moving with it, and so whether it's analyzable or not really doesn't matter all that much, because he's moving in chromatic motion from G sharp to G to F sharp. I think I can probably say the F sharp is more like he's playing a D7 chord, as if he's playing like 5 of 5 kind of deal. But however you do it, you don't actually need chords to analyze it. It just sounds good. The way that he plays the line, the repetition of that D to C to some lower note, and the rhythm that he uses, it sounds coherent even if he's not playing notes that are tightly tied to chord changes. So then you get to the last 4 bars. And he basically just plays an enclosure that gets him into A flat, like the flat 3 of F minor, and plays an F minor lick over the bar of F and F minor. And then he just plays in those last 2 bars, he lands on the 3rd and plays a little dominant implied lick down from F, D, B, and then plays a C major lick going up the scale and coming back down. So that's a look at the kinds of things that Sonny Rollins is playing on Newk's Fadeaway in the first chorus. He's got a lot of scalar stuff, a lot of like chromatic enclosures still, or neighbor tones. He's doing some diatonic enclosures, which we hadn't seen before, but are useful to note. Might be good to practice on various chord tones. And then I think the big takeaway, 2 big takeaways. One of them is the 5 augmented descending triad leading to 9 of the 1 chord. Very common. You hear it a lot. It's a cliche lick. You should probably learn it. Play it sometimes. Not too much. And then the other thing, which I think is more generally applicable across lots of different situations, is when you have extended dominant chords, you can extend the 2 chord, let's say 6 beats out of 8. You could play 2 minor stuff and then just dip into the 5 at the end of those last 2 bars, last 2 beats, to get you into whatever your next change is going to be. So that is the story on the first chorus of Newk's Fadeaway. Thanks for listening. Ta-da.